We know that physical activity burns calories, so it may be logical to assume that the more physical activity we do, the more calories we burn over time, but this isn't necessarily the case. This video is a short snippet from a research review discussion between Coach Dalton and I. We discuss a paper titled Constrained Total Energy Expenditure and Metabolic Adaptation to Physical Activity in Humans, and we go into the reasons why increasing your physical activity won't always lead to an increased calorie burn over time, and there is a limit to how much increasing your activity will lead to an additional calorie burn. This is why exercising more isn't always the best approach when it comes to losing fat. So we're going to talk a little bit about energy expenditure, what it is, and what this constrained theory proposes. So we know that energy expenditure is comprised of many different things. We've got our BMR, which is our basal metabolic rate, so the number of calories that your body burns at rest just to sustain its vital functionings. You've got calories burnt during exercise. You've got the thermic effect of feeding, so calories burnt digesting food. And then you've also got non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So this is just the calories that we burn day to day and doing things, any activity outside of exercise, such as walking, shopping, cleaning the house, all that kind of stuff. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about energy expenditure. And commonly, it is assumed that if we increase our physical activity, then the total number of calories burnt in a day is also going to increase. But this study proposes a different idea, and the constrained energy expenditure theory proposes that at a certain point, additional physical activity doesn't lead to a correlation in the number of total daily calories burnt. And yeah, we're going to get into that today.
So with this study, guys, what they did is they had 5 different populations ranging from the United States and within some African countries. They used those 5 different populations to then measure the anthropometrics of those guys. So it was limb height, body weight, fat mass, fat-free mass. They used all those calculations to get an idea for the relative energy cost of different portions of the body. And then they gave these people an activity tracker, and there's one that measures, it's what we call like a triaxial activity tracker. So it measures through a couple of different metrics, and it's a little bit more accurate than the ones that you typically find for $4 at Kmart, where it's just an accelerometer. So with these, they put them on people and they had all different lifestyles, and what they did is they had them wear them in and about their daily activity for a period of time. And then they pulled all that data back and poured it over into some statistical methods to try and analyze what was going on. Now, things that they were really trying to pay attention to was how much energy expenditure these people were doing in their day-to-day life, in their sedentary times, and when they were introducing physical activity. So these didn't discriminate between people that were doing manual labor versus going for a 2-hour run. But what they did show is obviously the intensity of that over time obviously changes, but the amount of time spent doing intense exercise, whether it be through their job or through formal exercise, was trying to be captured. And so that's what they used there. With that, they then poured over the data and found that there was some really cool inferences as to what was going on. So essentially what they did is found a relationship between people and what they were doing through their NEAT. Now, as Shannon mentioned before, there's non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That acronym is essentially a way that we capture people's subconscious activities that they go through over the course of the day. So you don't realize that you're doing these behaviors, but what actually happens is the way that your body accounts for some of the exercise expenditure or expenditure in total is through mechanisms like a psychological want to be standing or sitting. So you've got your perceived level of stresses that you've had happen throughout the day. And from that, your body goes, hey, I've spent a little bit of energy today. Maybe instead of standing, I'll sit. And it's one of the fatigue feedback mechanisms that we use to help conserve energy. Essentially, if we didn't have stuff like this, you could walk forever and essentially not feel a need to slow down and walk yourself to death. So it's a really smart mechanism to have, right? But what they found was that people shifting from a higher fidgeting output, they lowered or had a low output from after accounting for all this exercise, and especially as it tailored upwards. So manual people that were working out in the fields doing manual exercise, manual labor, and hard physical exercises were then shown as they increased that activity, they actually did less and less of these fidgeting, standing, sitting activities, and towards more a sedentary behavior. So if they were someone that fidgeted a lot at a lower physical activity level, as it peaked and got higher, they typically found that people had less fidgeting. And that's a really important one. But it's not just the fidgeting, it was the relationship between standing and sitting and lying down. So instead of having a point of view, or sorry, instead of having an expression of activity done in a way that is positive towards calorie expenditure, the body actually had an adaptive way of finding out how to downregulate that. So instead of standing up for half an hour, your body's found a way to encourage you to sit down for half an hour, saving on some calorie costs of just that physical activity itself. So as that scaled up, those behaviors became less and less, and the disconnect really became quite large from those who were doing a large amount of activity to the behaviors that they were showing down at the extreme ends. One of the other responses was some of the downregulation and some of the endocrine markers that they measured. So after about 40 weeks, that we know that women seem to have a reduction in ovarian output from the metabolic costs of just maintaining the reproductive tract after about 40 weeks of dieting is downregulated, as well as the reduction in estrogen. And we found that also in this study that was noticed as well, that as it tiered up towards the higher physical activity output, they had these lower metabolic markers.
So with these endocrine downregulations, it's not really something that we have much control over, and it is going to have an impact, but it's not going to prevent you if your goal is to lose weight. Because when we're talking about calorie expenditure and limits to that, it's probably going to be of interest to people who are trying to control their energy balance in order to lose weight. So these kind of things we can't particularly control. It's just a reaction, as Dalton said, to conserve energy, because your body is fighting against you. You don't want to be losing weight, right? So it's not a huge thing to worry about. What we should be focusing on is these other adaptations, such as the downregulation of NEAT. So when we say that increasing physical activity doesn't lead to a greater total daily energy expenditure, it does to begin with. So the lower your daily activity, they did find that increases in physical activity did correlate to a higher energy expenditure, but there is a cutoff point. And the change point that they found was at 230 counts per minute, and that's step counts per minute. That was where the relationship between physical activity and expenditure stopped correlating. So that's the cutoff point where increases beyond this point didn't lead to any more calories burn, and that's probably because that's when the adaptations are starting to take place. One of the interesting things that they found as well was that body weight was not a significant predictor of total energy expenditure. So you do get a lot of people thinking that the reason that they're overweight is that they've got a slow metabolism, which we know isn't particularly true, because the more you weigh, the faster your basal metabolic rate is, because it directly correlates to body weight. So that's an interesting finding, that no matter what the body weight, if you've got someone who weighs less and someone who weighs more, that doesn't predict how many calories you're going to burn over the course of the day, because things like NEAT do contribute massively to the daily calorie burn. So I think we can start talking about how we like to use this information in terms of programming exercise for clients, and what we take into consideration, I think specifically for fat loss clients, because they're the ones that we're trying to control the energy expenditure of. And so Dalton, if you'd like to talk about how you would, when implementing an exercise program and changes to the exercise program as well, what would you take into consideration?
So the first and foremost thing that I try and do is I'd introduce a lower amount of sessions for someone to do. I wouldn't go, if someone was coming to me with no exposure to training or hard, intense training especially, start off with a small amount of lower intensity sessions, probably 3 or 4, and watch what happens to how this person responds. Watch what happens to their mental clarity. Watch what happens to their food choices, how they respond if they report any increases in hunger cravings, what they then do for their adherence-wise to the rest of the training programs, like that if their first session is just as intense as the rest. So you can measure that through some easily heart rate monitoring, and gauge from a picture from there how they're going from that, and then slowly tier it upwards through 1 to 2 increases in session intensity to a point of moderate output. So if they're at 100 beats per minute with their heart rate for a lower intensity session, push it up somewhere to the 120 to the 140 range, and watch what's going on there. If you start to see compensation behaviors happening there, it might be a way that we can start now focusing on outside metrics away from the training session as to what you can do to capture those. And metrics that we like to use are Fitbit trackers, or step trackers, sorry, pedometers. It's a nice, easy way that we can target about 80% of the NEAT expenditure that you're doing over the course of the day in just daily activity expressed as steps. Now, I know that seems really rudimentary. It doesn't cover, obviously, fidgeting or times that you spend sitting down, or the amount of stress that you might be under, but it actually is super easy to account for how much activity. It's quite accurate for like its cost is really low, easy to implement. So it covers off on a few different pros there. So you can use that to capture what's going on with their expenditure outside of the gym, outside of and away from the workouts. Now, a good way to do this is to have them wear one over a period of time whilst you are introducing these sessions, and not necessarily set a step target for them. What you're trying to do is gauge how much activity they're doing outside of these sessions already. Then with the introduction of these sessions, watch for a reduction in their step account, and see if from the lower intensity stuff, if that's impacting them, or if it's starting when you introduce the moderate sessions. If you don't see anything then, you can obviously continue increasing the moderate intensity sessions to a total of 3 or 4, and continue to watch. And then if that's not happening, then you continue to push up either through weight training or cardiovascular training into a more intense session, and then starting to take note there. You'll generally start to find between the ratio of moderate to intense exercise sessions for most people that you'll start to find a decline is going to happen with their steps, their output of what's going on. And that's the physiological behaviors, the down regulation that we're talking about before. That's where we're capturing what's going on, where the body's trying to find ways to conserve energy. So essentially the body is measuring an output from a training session, and internally the brain and the body thinks that it's just survived an attack. Essentially, if you break it down to like the bare feedback, it's like, holy shit, how did I not die? How can I make sure that doesn't happen again? And by doing that, if I conserve some energy, it means that if that happens again, I'm going to have a lot more energy available to run away than I would if I'm just going to walk around, continue looking for handbags or, at work. So that's what's going on there. So by having those small ways to capture the steps, capture the activity of what's going on, find that relationship as to when it starts to swing to the negative, so reduce the output, capturing that, and then introducing a target to account to offset or to potentially increase so that those down regulations don't happen.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important to pay attention to your individual response to like a new activity, exercise program, things like that, because whenever we're looking at studies, we're mostly looking at averages, right? So we know that the trend is that after a certain point, physical activity doesn't add any more additional calories burnt over the course of the day. But that point, as you said, is in general 230 counts per day, per minute per day. That's going to be different for everyone. So knowing your own individual response to training, and that's why we measure all these things and pay attention to each person individually. So we're knowing what the trend is, and then we're looking for that response in someone and finding their exact cutoff point almost. So I think it's really important to, when you're thinking about exercising, thinking about the purpose of your training program, because a lot of people, it's very common for people to try and exercise as a means of burning calories in order to lose fat. Now, we've just discussed that you are burning calories, obviously, when you're exercising, but there is that compensation. So using your exercise program as the primary means of fat loss is probably going to be unsuccessful. It's very difficult to try and directly match the exact amount of calories you're burning to the amount that you're eating on a day-to-day basis. I just think it's really important to have that discussion about moving away from looking at exercise as calorie burning, because there's many different functions of exercise, right? Your training program, and you might be training for hypertrophy, trying to grow muscle, trying to sculpt your body to look a certain way, and that's what you're training for, not necessarily as a means of burning calories. You might be training for strength, you're a power lifter, all of this kind of stuff. There's many different reasons to train. And of course, things like cardio, we are burning calories, but it's not the primary reason for training. And that's why as well, it's very important, if your goal is fat loss, to pay attention to your nutrition. That's going to be far easier to manage in terms of controlling the amount of calories you're consuming, rather than trying to control the amount of calories you're expending.
And that wraps up today's video. I hope you found it useful. Be sure to like and subscribe to stay in the loop with us. And if you want to check out the other cool things that we've got going on, then have a look at the description box. That's also where you'll find us on Facebook and Instagram. Cool. Thanks guys. See you in the next one.